Welcome to the first episode of How to Listen to a Song with Ken Marino. And today's tune is Supper's Ready, the 25-minute long opus from Genesis's 1972 album, Foxtrot. Now this might, you think, be a little bit of a difficult place to start, but I think it offers a good opportunity to look at a song that on the surface might seem very complex, but when we get into it, it might not be as difficult to unravel some meaning behind it. So the progressive rock movement that came out of London in the 1960s and 70s was quite an extraordinary phenomenon, birthing bands like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis, Jethro Tull, Gentle Giant, Pink Floyd, these really great, well-known bands of the 1960s British rock scene. And I think it really started with the Beatles, and also the experiments with LSD played a big part of it. But most notably is the interest in the improvisational music of America, especially Black Americans, the blues and jazz, which was very popular around London in the early and mid 1960s with bands like the Graham Bond Organization, with John McLaughlin on guitar, Jack Bruce on bass, and Ginger Baker on drums, and then later the Blues Breakers with John Mayall, and that birthed Eric Clapton and Cream with Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. And also part of the Blues Breakers were John McVie and Mick Fleetwood from Fleetwood Mac. So they birthed a lot of these early blues bands. The Rolling Stones are another great example of that, right? That were interested in improvisational music and interested in musical exploration. There was also a lot going on. The invention of the mellotron and the Moog synthesizer. Of course, even the electric guitar was something new. So people were experimenting with these new sounds. It was very exciting. Now, Supper's Ready is probably, for many progressive rock fans from that period, their favorite piece of music. For me, there would be other songs that I would put ahead of it that I enjoy a lot better, but I'm starting there because it is kind of a progressive rock magnum opus, so to speak. And so if we're deciphering the tune, one of the things I tell my students is that just think of one emotion or one idea that comes forth when you're listening to a piece of music. In this piece, it starts in this domestic situation. There's a man and a woman, and they're in a living room, and supper's ready. So we might say, well, what is the real meaning behind this? And what happens is that it is transformed into a religious ritual of sorts. So it brings up right away images of the communication of the church, right? Where the supper is the Lord's Supper. And the scene is kind of sacralized with these saintly men and a cross and, kind of these numbers, right? So it seems like a little bit obscure, but one of the things that these guys are all facing in the band, and the music is written by all the guys in the band coming together, Tony Banks on keyboards, Mike Rutherford on bass and guitar, Phil Collins, of course, Steve Hackett on guitar as well, and Peter Gabriel on vocals and flute. They're all young men, they're in their early 20s, in the late teens, some of these guys, early 20s from these bands. And, they're just getting married, they're starting to have families, and they're being kind of taken away from their family life because of life on the road. So if you look at what happens in this opening scene, the protagonist turns off the television, and the last car fades off into the distance. So the outer world is left behind. So think about one word that you would come up with that would describe this opening scene to you.
Walking across the sitting room, I turn the television off. Sitting beside you, I look into your eyes as the sound of motor cars fades in the night time. I swear I saw your face change It didn't seem quite right. And it's hello, babe, with your guardian eyes so blue. Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true? Coming closer with our eyes, a distance falls around our bodies. Out in the garden, the moon seems very bright. 6 saintly shrouded men move across the lawn slowly. The 7th walks in front with a cross held high in hand. And it's, hey babe, your supper's waiting for you. Hey my baby, don't you know our love is true? I've been so far from here, far from your warm arms. It's good to feel you again. It's been a long, long time, hasn't it?
One of the things I love about Genesis is this use of 2 12-string guitars. Now, in the 6-string guitar, you have the 6 strings, and then the 12-string guitar has kind of a sympathetic ring. So you get this very bright, resonant sound that sounds like a harpsichord to me. And it brings you back, thinking to maybe an earlier time, 17th century to the High Middle Ages. And so there's a little bit of nostalgia going on here. That, of course, was something that the progressive bands were known for as well. So it starts off, the word that I would use is creating this idea of alienation. So the way I see this opening is this scene of domesticity is alienated to our protagonist because he's been away for such a long time. And he actually says that. And his spouse is looking at him like, something's just not quite right, he says, And so this is how I interpret this opening. And the thing that I love about the tune going on from here is in romantic poetry of the 18th and 19th century, there is this theme of the city versus the country. You have this mass immigration of people from the rural areas, the pagan areas, coming into the cities. And there is this discourse of this loss of connection of nature, this loss of connection in life to what is important. And this is what's being opened up here. So the next piece, the next section, the thing that comes to mind is it starts to get very Beatlesque for me. One of the things in Penny Lane in particular that Paul McCartney writes about is these typical scenes, the fire truck, that you see around Penny Lane, where people in his hometown are going about their day. And the next lyric evokes that idea and also this image of the farm. So what the farmer and the fireman have in common is the use of water. And water definitely brings up a religious imagery right away. It's an idea of cleansing, baptism, renewal. So there is this time of renewal, and at the same time now what we're going to have is this time of seduction. We're going to be introduced to the eternal sanctuary man who promises a lot of things to us. But we have to be really careful because we could be chasing after, illusions, thinking that we're chasing after something that is real. And how this really pertains to, I think, we could also look at this as giving up our connection to the land and giving up our connection to things in life that are important at the expense for material gains, for other things that we seek after. There's this tension, right? What we talked about in the beginning, these guys are all at the age now where they're starting to have families and their music is the center of their life, but the life on the road and the concentration of making their art. And, most of these bands put out an album every year and went on tour, and put another album, went on tour. Jethro Tull, in the course of some 13 years, put out 12 albums. And, Yes and Genesis, throughout these years, basically every year they put out an album, sometimes twice in a year. Sometimes they take a year off, but they were putting out album after album after album, kind of, what Peter Gabriel would talk about later, kind of being in this machine where you're churning out albums and you're churning out product for the industry, and how in the long run this is very destructive. You're kind of selling your soul to the devil.
Yes, he's here again. Can't you see he's fooled you all? Share his peace, sign the lease. He's a supersonic scientist. He's a guaranteed eternal sanctuary man. Look into my mouth, he cries. And all the children lost on many paths. I bet my life will walk inside, hand in hand, gland in gland, with a spoonful of miracle. He's the guaranteed eternal sanctuary.
The next section is Willow's Farm, and for me, we're in the world of the Beatles. A lot of the stuff that they did in the later on that was kind of fantastical, that was kind of Lewis Carroll influence, were just kind of bizarre and zany, and they're really talking also a lot about the history of England, as a colonizer, going to the New World of America, seeing the Indian people there, also World War II with Winston Churchill. So they're conjuring up these images and throwing around these images that really resonate with English history here.
A flower? If you go down to Willow Farm to look for butterflies, butterbugs, gutterflies, open your eyes. It's full of surprise. Everyone lies like the fox on the rocks. And the musical box. Oh, there's mom and dad and good and bad, and everyone's happy to be here. There's Winston Churchill dressed in drag. He used to be a British flag. Plastic bag, what a rag! The frog was a prince. The prince was a brick. The brick was an egg. The egg was a bird.
Fly away, you sweet little thing. They are hot in your tail.
Hadn't you heard?
To change you to a human being.
Yes, we're happy as fish and gorgeous as geese and wonderfully clean in the morning.
Listening to the band members talk about this piece, they talk about how they didn't want it to sound like the musical box, which has a very similar opening. And so they wanted to evolve into something that was a little bit contrasting. So they stuck this Willow's Farm piece in the middle. See, so from my interpretation, this really makes a lot of sense because we're talking about this contrast between the country and the city, the farm life, right? And then they've also said that the work that they did at the end was some of the best work they've ever done as a band, which is the Apocalypse in 9/8. So here we kind of go back to this ambience in the beginning where the piece kind of sits back for a while until it goes into the ending, which is a march. Now, another tune that that has the same theme, talks a lot about science and technology versus nature. But this was a very big Emerson, Lake and Palmer theme as well, a very big King Crimson theme. And actually, Keith Emerson was a big Genesis fan, and Genesis wrote the song "The Knife" off their Trespass album about Keith Emerson, who used to stab his Hammond keyboard, right? Which is a real fun gesture of like the artist killing his music and making something new, that real struggle for creative novelty that an artist goes through. And Tarkus has that march at the end. So I think it's very similar to Tarkus in that way. And I don't think these bands were, they weren't working in a vacuum. They were playing off each other. They were developing something as band members and as a community of artists who were addressing these same concerns that revolved around the escalation of violence in the post-world with the proliferation of weaponry, especially nuclear weapons. Kind of ending part before the return to the beginning, which is known as the Apocalypse in 9/8. Now, I had originally read that it was Phil Collins who put it in 9/8, but listening to the 2007 special, he doesn't take ownership of that. Yes, at the time we're touring with Mahavishnu Orchestra, and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, of course, did these really intricate time signatures. And I read it once in a book many, many years ago that Peter Gabriel, the drummer from Genesis, and Bill Bruford, the drummer of Yes, used to get together and listen to Mahavishnu records. But it is something that a drummer would do. Phil Collins does take credit for the 5/4 in the beginning that opens up the album Foxtrot with Watcher of the Skies, and It's very easy to take something that is an 8 and make it a 9. So if you have something that goes dun 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 dun, all you need to do is dun 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 dun. So usually when you break up a meter into an odd meter, you break up the groups. You could break, like if you was in 9, you could break it up into 3, 3, and 3. Dot 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 dot. You could break it up into 4, 3, and 2. Dot 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 dot. You could break it up into 4 plus 3 plus 2, right? Dot 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 dot. It's just adding or taking away a beat. So you go dot 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 dot. That's 8, right? Dot 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 dot. You just take away one beat, dot 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 dot, and you have 7. And drummers would be more apt to think about music in those ways, to think about these more intricate rhythms than other members of the band. But he doesn't take ownership for that. So here we are in the world of the Apocalypse, in the world of the Bible, in the world of Genesis and Revelation. Magog is the son of Noah. Is one of the son of one of the sons of Noah, and it's an area that's named for him in Turkey where Armageddon is supposed to start. 666 is Satan is no longer alone. We have this world in complete conflict, and how is it resolved? Well, we will see. So 666 is also blowing out rock and roll. So this kind of is another reason why I interpret the song the way I interpret it, because it is their call to be rock and roll musicians that is kind of bringing them into the world of temptation and taking them away from their world of domesticity as a symbol of kind of like the modern world of needing to take care of the needs of business over the needs of family. It's a very big theme in a lot of movies and books of the 1950s and 60s. Now, these guys went to what would be called a public school, Charterhouse Public School in Surrey. And so they were definitely, they had learned about, these great English writers, going back to Shakespeare and Milton and, of course, William Blake and George Bernard Shaw. So they probably were very attuned to some of the themes that we're talking about that had worked their way into literature. For my interpretation here, it makes sense now, the reprise of the beginning, because what is the solution to this problem? It's to come back to the beginning and to find value in the things that are important in life, like your spouse, like your family. And so we have a reprise that goes into kind of a coda that really takes the song out from something that, it's very minor, it's very mystical, a little bit dark, maybe even a little, in the beginning, it's a little bit somber. By the end, we hear this like triumphant use of fanfares. This was also very much a part of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's music. Keith Emerson loved his fanfare, so you could see that influence of going back and forth, how these bands played off each other.
To get back home. There's an angel standing in the sun, and he's crying the night voice. This is the supper of the mighty one. Lord of lords, King of kings, has returned to lead his children home, to take them to the new Jerusalem.
So here, when we come into this closing section, he says everything is going to be all right. And we have this nice, like, strong downbeat of the one chord and everything resolves. And then later again, when he says, come back home, it's the same thing. I find that as kind of a unity of why is everything okay? Because in this journey, we come back home. In this journey of being on the road, we come back home. In this journey of life, we come back home. In this journey of trying to find out what's important to life, we find what's important to life. I mean, it's the oldest theme in the book, right? I mean, from the Odyssey of Homer through, the Wizard of Oz, right? It's the oldest theme, and here we see it again. Ends up, what happens is the apocalypse. The Mighty One comes back. He takes his children home. And it's an apocalyptic story, that takes Bible imagery and uses it in a way that is reflective of what's happening in current events. I talk a little bit about this in my book, Traipsing the Apocalypse. What my book was an answer to the belief that somehow the artistic world was out of touch with what was happening with the religious world and what was happening, religiously, because religious themes play a really important part in music. American music comes out of the Black church, comes out of the Pentecostal church, comes out of religious music. It often expresses religious themes. And so this is such a great example of a popular music that was expressing religious themes in a way that made it very relevant to what people were experiencing in the present time. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I'm Ken Marino, signing off.